Okay, so I've hit the record button. Again, Q&A at the end. The only thing I say is that I might split this session into two. It's quite a long session. I want to give you the opportunity to have the Q&A. So let's just wait and see. So today I'm going to focus on how we motivate others. And if you remember in the last session, I talked about the psychology of motivation and how do we motivate ourselves. So today I'm going to look at it from a work perspective or a career perspective, simply because this is where a lot of the research has been done, but also because it's very applicable lens for many of the people on this call. And this idea of humanistic or modern management started about 100 years ago. And you might say that in parallel to this, the type of work that humans do, that we do, has evolved. And because of these two factors, we have both dramatically improved our understanding of motivation, but also we've evolved the practices, the methods, etc., for motivating people. So I'm going to begin by going off on 2 or 3 or 4 different tangents, different strings that, different strands really, that I want to introduce at the beginning so that we have them under our belt, because they'll begin to tie it up more as we begin the session in earnest and to look at the different methods of the different content, etc. So before 3 or 4 different things to talk about, and then they'll come together later on. Apologies in advance. It's evening time here. I live near the airport. Planes are coming in at this time, so you'll probably hear them in the background all the way through. We'll see how many come in. So let me start sharing the screen as I normally do, and let me hide myself while I do that, because it's better for me. So I'm doing that. Let me share the screens now, and we can start in our earnest. Okay. So we should start to see that now. Let me just give it a second. Right, Motivating 101 is coming in now. Let me just bring it up. Take me a second to get started. You should be seeing that now. So I'm going to start with a couple of stats, and not all of these stats, and this isn't a session for stats, but it's very interesting to kind of give some background on this in terms of career well-being and engagement. And Gallup, who are one of the global leaders in terms of surveying worldwide on different elements of career and well-being within careers and engagement within careers, their surveys back in 2020-21 have found that roughly 7 in 10 employees are struggling or suffering rather than thriving in their overall lives. So this is not just at work, this is overall. And they have a specific set of categories in terms of how they believe the present is and how much they believe the future is going to be good, etc., etc. So I won't go into detail on how they break it down. What does struggling, suffering, or thriving mean? But thriving is that you believe that life is good and that it's going to continue to improve. So what they're saying here is that roughly 7 out of 10 people are either struggling or suffering, and suffering is in a bad state, basically. And if we go down about 3 or 4 bullet points, we start seeing about engagement, and this is purely about work. So in the UK, where I live, 1 in 10 people are engaged at work, and 89% or 9 out of 10 people are disengaged. And it's a slightly different number globally, but it's no better, really. 1 in 5 or 8 out of 10 people globally are not engaged. And the USA is way out in front with 34% engaged. In other words, 1/3 of people are engaged at work. But again, this means that 2/3 of people are not engaged at work. And I think that's the statistic that strikes me more than anything else. So I'm not going to harp on this. I do give other sessions that goes into a lot more detail about this. But in these, the 2 things are to remember are that 3 out of 10 people are actually thriving in their overall lives, and only 1 in 10 in the UK and 2 out of 10 globally are engaged at work. Next thing I'm going to do is, again, another strand. I'm going to talk about this. I'm just going to give you some definitions. Behaviors. So behaviors are the way in which a person behaves in response to a particular situation or stimulus. And I used this word intrinsic or extrinsic in the last session. So basically, our behaviors are what we do, the actions that we take. And they're either in response to something internal in our brain or something external. So I will reach for a coffee cup. Or if I drop my coffee cup and now a situation changes and I will get something to clean it up. And last week I gave an argument to give a kind of to explain motivation as standing behind behaviors and be that prioritization tool or processor of all the different parts of the brain, the internal stimuli and the external stimuli, and bringing them all together to actually prioritize what we do next. So it says here about motivation is the brain processes that energize and direct behaviors. And another one is motivation is the process that initiates, that guides and maintains goal-oriented behaviors. So our motivation sits right behind our behaviors and decides what we do next. And what is motivation in business? Motivation is the best ways a business can encourage staff to give their best. Motivated staff care about the success of the business and work better. A motivated workforce results in increased output caused by extra effort from the workers. So there's the definitions. Let's sweep them out. We've had some stats. We've now had some definitions of what behavior and motivation is to us. And let's just for a second, very simple one. What do we, if we're at work, what do we as a worker bring to the table? We give our time, we give effort, loyalty, education, commitment, enthusiasm, sacrifice, and many, many other things as well. And then what are the outputs we expect? What are the things that we want from work? We want reward, we want learning, pension, recognition, responsibility, achievement, and many, many more things. I just want to get our creative juices started to start saying, right, what do we want out of work? And what do we bring to the table? And if you look at these outputs, you will see that some of the outputs we expect are what I will now go on to explain is intrinsic and some are extrinsic. Reward. So let me go to the next slide. Intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is when you engage in behavior because you find it rewarding. You're performing an activity for its own sake rather than from the desire from external reward. So very simply put, bonuses are an extrinsic motivation, whereas enjoyment of our work is intrinsic. And again, extrinsic motivation involves completing a task or exhibiting a behavior because of outside causes, such as avoiding punishment or receiving a reward. So you can see here, extrinsic is coming from someone else. And if we go back to the last slide, we can see reward from the business that we're working in is extrinsic. Learning is intrinsic. Pension is extrinsic. It's money. Recognition is from someone else. Responsibility is, well, what is responsibility? I suppose that's kind of, it comes from others. Yeah, it's extrinsic. And achievement is intrinsic. And then as I talk about different models in this session, I'm going to talk about two different types of models. We have a process motivation model and a content motivation model. So the process models show us how we are motivated. And I'll explain this as we go along. But, you know, in terms of do we offer, how are we motivated? Let me talk about the content models first. Sorry, I'm slipping behind a small bit. There's someone at the door. Content models are what motivates us. In other words, we talk about what is our purpose. Is it purpose? Is it achievement? Is it reward? What motivates us? What are the things that motivate us? And then how are we motivated is how, let's say, how our bosses treat us. Here's a model for how bosses should treat you, in other words, to better motivate you. And this would be a process motivation. I'll explain one of them as I go along so that we can see it better. So let me start off with this. And normally, when we talk about models, and not a lot of people talk about the Cynefin framework. But for me, it's absolutely crucial to understanding how motivation has changed over the last 100 years. And this Cynefin framework, that's how it's pronounced, is a sense-making framework. And it's basically addressing the question, how do we solve a problem? And what this is saying is that there are 4 different ways of working to solve different problems. And basically, when we say solving a problem, what I mean is at work in terms of our career. How do we work? How do we solve problems at work? Same thing. So we've got 4 different 4 different quadrants here. The first one is obvious in the bottom right, followed by complicated, complex, and chaotic. And I'm actually very much going to go through only 3 of them and not the last one about chaotic, even though I will give a slight explanation of it. Obvious ways of working. So how do we solve a problem like boiling an egg? And this is an obvious problem that we're trying to solve. And a couple of things that you'd probably note about boiling an egg is, firstly, is that if you go on the internet and read up about how do you boil an egg, it'll say the same thing all the time. There is one way, a best practice for boiling an egg. We will put a pot full of water, either boiling or not boiling, on the stove, add the heat to it, and then we will boil our egg for 12 minutes if we like it that way. There is no one who gets out a Bunsen burner and fashions some sort of artifact out of clay and then boils an egg in that way. We very much do it the same way. Farming is another way to look at it. If you plant carrots, if you go all over a certain area, like in the UK, and you ask all the farmers how they plant carrots, they will probably all give you the same way to do it. It's an obvious problem, and we use a best practice way of working on it. The next one is the same, and the results are always the same. If you boil that egg for 12 minutes and you do that 100 times, the result will always be the same. And slightly different than that is what we call a complicated problem. And a complicated problem could be something like putting together an old-fashioned watch with cogs. And again, it's more tricky, more difficult to put it together. But if you had all the pieces and you put them all together in the same way each time, you would have a watch that you could wind up and it would go, and you would be able to tell the time each time. Another example would be something like a production line, putting together a production line. If you had 100,000 parts put together a production line to make cars, and you did that in Germany, and then you put the raw materials in, you would come out with a car at the other end, you would add petrol to it, and it would start to go. And if you built that same factory, that same production line in Peru, the same thing would happen. You would put in the raw materials, put in the petrol, and the car would start driving away at the end of that. And that's a complicated problem that we're solving, like a production line. And again, the point about this is that the results are the same. If we put a car through a production line, every single time the car would come out the other end in the same way. The results would be predictable. When we get into complex, this is where a lot of the work that we do nowadays is happening. Complex basically means that that the result is not predictable. Putting a person on Mars would be the result of something complex. Trying to drive a self-driving car from A to B would be something complex. And anything to do with humans is complex. And the result will differ each time you repeat the activity. And anything, again, to do with humans. If you had a child and you fed them the same meal for 3 days in a row, they would absolutely love it. And then the 4th day, they would turn around and say, I've never liked this in my life. Something simple like that. And we have to work in different ways to address complex problems. Now, chaos or chaotic problem is something like I used to work in, where I would work with systems that went down. And so I worked for large retailers, and we had large websites with backends. And chaotic is when you are trying to address a problem with that. If your credit card system went down, that would be a chaotic problem that you were trying to solve. And so if I ignore chaotic for a minute and I talk about obvious, complicated, and complex, and I talk about it from a historical view, what's interesting is that if we look at the second industrial revolution, which started around 1870, which is when technology started to come into it. Before that time, a lot of the work that people did was obvious. Farming, we would regard that as an obvious problem to solve or an obvious way of working. And then with, at that time then, the Industrial Revolution or the Second Industrial Revolution, let's say things like looms for weaving looms and automation of weaving looms. those for the first time would be reaching into complicated work. And so while we had farming or building a house 200 years ago would be very much the same structure, we would build the floor, then we would build the walls, then we would build the roof. And it was a very obvious way of working. And so only in the second industrial revolution, about 1870, did we start using complicated work. And this was the start, and I'm going to talk in a minute about what began to happen. A gentleman called Frederick Winslow Taylor, how we started to analyze work at that time, at the same time as humans started doing complicated work. And it's only in the last 50 years that we've really delved into that area of complex work. And a lot of the area that I work in software over the years, and working with software people and development people, has been in that area of complex work. And this is where this term knowledge workers came up with, people who understand the work more than their bosses do. And they were working on complex work. And over the last 50 years, we've actually developed new ways of working in order to address the fact that the work was complex. And a lot of people would say, oh, that's because it was software development, but it wasn't. It was to address what we call complex work. So designing something, if you design something that works in Germany, it won't work in Peru in the same way, because once you release it to the public, they won't like it, a banking app or something like that. So people who are working on complex problems, knowledge workers, motivation has had to change and transform to address the type of work that they were doing. So that's the Cynefin framework. And I started in the Cynefin framework around 1870. I said that is when we started getting into complicated work. And this gentleman, Frederick Winslow Taylor, he started to analyze what made people effective and efficient around the same time, 1880s to 1810. And he came out with this very, very famous work, The Principles of Scientific Management, in 1911. And it's sometimes referred to Taylorism. And it was the first time that people started looking at, how do I scientifically understand how to improve management? So he looked at work as a process, but he also worked as people as a subset of this process. So to give you an example, one of the things that he would have done, a simple thing, is that he put 10, I'm making this up about the amount of tonnage, but he would put 10 tons of coal in a yard in one position. And he would have 5 burly men with shovels to move that pile of coal from A to B. And then he would time how long it took them. And then he would take a shovel of a different dimension, and he would get them to shovel the coal from B to A. And he would measure how long it took them. So it was very simply, for the first time, using scientific methods to better understand how to manage and how to make profit from management, if you really look at it that way. And so the only thing about it was what I said earlier, that he considered people to be part of the process. So and when you look at that type of work, if it's looking at simple work, if you want to motivate someone to do simple work like shift coal from A to B, then if you gave them $1 per ton, if you gave them $1.20, there's a good chance that they will work quicker. So doing simple work to motivate people, it could be that intrinsic motivation works, that you give them money, something simple like that. But around 1920, 1930s, we had some light bulb moments. And this is one of a number of them, a guy called Elton Mayo. And he was the first, one of the first. There was many others who were involved in this. But his experiment was quite unusual. And it was with the Western Electric company in Chicago, and about 20,000 people involved in this. And he wanted to understand the effects of light on how people work. And what he found was that when he would come in and he would say to people, this is the experiment I'm trying to do, and he would set the lighting higher, let's say, he started low and he lifted the light. And what he found was he got better results. And then he lifted it within reasonable amounts. And then he lifted it again, he got better results. And then he put the lighting down and he got even better results. And he found that no matter what he did, whether he lifted the lighting or raised the lighting or lowered it, he found that the results got better. And in his light bulb moment, what he realized was that it was the consultation with the staff, with the people, that was the shift to make them respond better. He concluded that people's work performance is dependent on both social relationships and the job content. So Frederick Winslow Taylor, in his Taylorism, said that people are machines, automations, and if you give them more money, they will work harder. And Elton Mayo, for the first time, said, if you start to consult people, if you make them part of the solution, if you engage with them, if you are humanistic in terms of your approach, you will get more from people. So again, we saw Winslow Taylor had his approach was something that would work very well with simple work. And Elton Mayo was the first guy, one of the people who was starting to work with people who were working in complicated work. And in the 1940s, we had Maslow. And I'll be surprised if you haven't heard of Abraham Maslow in the 1940s. He was a psychiatrist, and he came up with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And basically, if you look at this, if you look at the pyramid, and he didn't totally represent it as a pyramid, basically what he said was that the fundamental need we have is physiological needs. We need air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, etc., reproduction. Now, he didn't exactly say this, but a lot of people repeated this afterwards, is that when we satisfy these needs, we then move on to the next level of needs, which are our safety needs. We need employment. We need our health, property. And then when we satisfy safety needs, we move on to needing love and belonging, friendship, intimacy, family. Now, Maslow never actually said that, but it is a good way of looking at it. But what he did say is that we work on all of these and we try to satisfy all of these. And the more that we satisfy them, the more we focus on the other elements. Esteem, two sides of esteem: self-esteem, our respect for ourselves, and then how others see us, that we want esteem from others. So you could kind of break that down into two different areas. And then at the top of it is self-actualization, trying to be the best that we can be, trying to make the most of ourselves. And he later on added self-transcendence, or transcendence on above that even. But the hierarchy of needs always just includes these 5 levels. And a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk in a minute of you'll start to see connections with the Cynefin framework, the type of work that we were doing and what motivates us, but also looking at it from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in that it is, and when we look inside ourselves, we will see, my God, these are the things that I need, that I do worry if I don't have a job. I do, if I don't have belonging or a family, I start to consider that. It is important to me what other people think of myself. And maybe you are a person who is trying to self-actualize, who is trying to say, right, what is my purpose here? What is my purpose in life? What type of work should I do? And beyond work, how should I live my life? And so this is, and it's funny because there's another term that I probably won't get today, which is this term positive psychology. And he was the first guy to start using this, which is basically this idea of psychology and not being about illness, but this idea about how do we make the best of ourselves? How do we try to be the best that we can be? So moving on from Maslow, and you'll start seeing him coming across, Douglas McGregor actually worked with Maslow. So Maslow, we need to address these hierarchy of needs, these different, if we don't look at these and not understand what's important to an individual, we won't be able to motivate them. If a person is focused, if a person is just about to get kicked out of their house and we give them lots of respect, lots of recognition, it won't be as important to them as having food on the table. And then for people who are pretty secure in terms of food on the table and they have their own home, then maybe it's esteem, maybe it's self-actualization. And Douglas McGregor, he used to work actually for a time with Maslow. And he came up well, he actually came up with theory X, theory Y, and what he called theory Z. But let's just focus on two for today: theory X and theory Y. And this is what I struggled with a couple of minutes ago of trying to put an explanation on, which is a process motivation model. And theory X is very much about, it is an assumption that we make. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that no one is purely theory X or theory Y, and I'll go through what they are in a second. But we have to understand the prevailing culture where we work. Are we working in theory X or theory Y? And that, maybe I should have said these afterwards, but let me explain theory X. Theory X is when we believe that the people who we work with or the people that we're trying to motivate don't want to be there. When can I go home? They only work because they have to earn the money, so that they can and they want to do as little as they can to earn this money. That is an attitude that we have for the people that we're trying to motivate. And people try to use carrot and stick with that external extrinsic motivation, the threat of punishment. If you don't do this, you'll get in trouble. If you do this, I'll give you a bonus. And theory Y is where we say, maybe we say yes, that people don't want to be here, but while they're here, they want to do their best, that they will be passionate, that they will be enthusiastic about the work that they're doing. And because of that, we can give them our trust and we can give them things like responsibility. And so you can see from that whatever attitude you have, the type of ways that you motivate people are going to be dependent on that. And if you work in a culture, and many of us have worked in a culture at work where it was carrot and stick, where it was theory X motivation from the top down, then we worked in a very specific way. And theory Y people, a theory Y environment, was very much about autonomy for people, responsibility, where we believed in their enthusiasm for the role. And even McGregor at that time in the 50s and 60s did believe himself in this idea of theory Y, in that, and we started coming out at this time with the term knowledge workers being intelligent and enthusiastic about their work. And we started believing that that was true. So we need to understand, number one, what culture we are in. Are we in a theory X or theory Y culture? And number two, ask ourselves what we believe. Do we believe that people only work because they have to? And again, back to this Cynefin framework, are we working in simple, complicated, or complex? And these will help us to understand. And what way are you working now to motivate people, but also what way would you like to motivate them in the future? So I'm going to give you 4 or 5 different models now. That was kind of the second one. Well, Maslow, if we start with Maslow, then McGregor. And each of them are different models, or different ways of looking at this, of how to motivate people. And so the best way to kind of take these slides is not to say, I'm going to do this one and this one, is to take the best out of all of these models. So Frederick Hertzberg, in the 1950s and 60s, he had a very, very interesting observation. He called it Hertzberg's two-factor theory. The first thing is that people will be dissatisfied if we don't get the basics right. And he called them hygiene factors. So if people are working in an environment where there is, if they work in a factory and there is dirt everywhere, that we're not cleaning this factory properly, that would be a hygiene factor. So in other words, it will never give us job satisfaction to work in a dirty environment, but it will make us dissatisfied. And he separated out satisfaction from job dissatisfaction and said that they're separate things. So in other words, in order to solve the problem of dissatisfaction, we have to deal with the hygiene factors and get them in order. If our wages are much, much less than everyone else in another business or in the people that we work with, if we're not given the status that we think we deserve, then these are hygiene factors. But if we satisfy them, it won't make us motivated. In order to be motivated, we've got to work on other things: achievement, recognition, the work itself, advancement, personal growth. So just to kind of say that again, he said Hertzberg's two-factor theory says that there are two different elements: job dissatisfaction and job satisfaction. And we have to address them separately, the hygiene factors for dissatisfaction and the motivation factors to motivate people. And that if we solve all the hygiene factors, we will not satisfy people. In the same way as that if we give them all the recognition and the achievement that we want, and yet the toilets are a mess without going into any detail, then people will be dissatisfied. So let me move on from there. This, I like Clayton Alderfer's ERG theory. And again, when you look at this, growth, relatedness, and existence is very much kind of a breakdown or taking Maslow's 5 areas and breaking it down into kind of 3 simpler areas. We want growth, which is about self-actualization and in the esteem area. We want relatedness, which is our relationships with others, and existence, which is basically the lower 2 levels, safety and security and physiological, from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But what I like about this one is that, so he's saying the same thing as Maslow, but what's interesting about it is he's saying that we need all 3 of these, or from Maslow, all the 5 different levels. And he makes the point, excuse me a second, he makes the point that if people need growth, they need to get the opportunity to learn at what they're doing, to get better at it, to prove themselves at their job, and to have mastery of their job, to grow as people, etc., etc. What he's saying is that if we're in a job or in a role or in a career where that is blocked, where we're not growing, that we will turn to the next level down. And this is one that kind of has always struck me as true, is that sometimes I have seen people who are very good at making relationships at work. They spend a lot of time with people, and to the detriment of the work that they're doing. And his point is that if we don't give them the opportunity to grow, they will turn to the next level down, the next tier down, and they will focus more on relatedness. So they will focus more on relationships. And I've seen this in practice many times. And if that doesn't happen, if people don't feel secure and safe in their relationships at work, then we will turn to existence, which is basically, am I earning enough money? And I have seen this as well, that people who don't get on very well at work are not fulfilled at work, and they're just there for the money. And so Alderfer, even though he talks about the same levels as Maslow, his point is that all the areas, his three, growth, relatedness, and existence, need to be satisfied. And if we don't satisfy all 3, people will turn to the next level down and start to give it more and more focus. Interesting one. So Victor Vroom, I like this one as well. And I'm not going to go into detail on what this slide says. I'm just going to keep it very, very simple in terms of what he's saying. Again, this is a process model, the one that I wasn't able to, I got tongue-tied about at the beginning. So what Victor Vroom says is that expectancy multiplied by instrumentality multiplied by valence is equal to motivation. Mathematical theory, but let's break it down. So people have an expectancy that their effort will lead to a higher performance. And this also means the recognition of higher performance. So in other words, if I do this, will I be recognized? Will I get better? Will other people see me as better? And then instrumentality is, will my performance lead to the outcomes that I want? So, and then I'll go through the last one then, and I'll come back and then will the performance then lead to reward? Do I find the outcomes desirable? So let me give you a simple analogy. If I had someone at work and I said to them, if you work for this whole week, and I'll give it something simple. If you data entry all this information into the system, If you give me this effort, then at the end of the week, I will give you half a day off. Or I could say I would give you money or something like this. So that's the first chain in the link. And this is a very good analogy about this idea of a chain in the link. So the expectancy is a link. Let's move on to the link then of instrumentality in the chain. So if I do that performance and I do that for a week and you don't give me the reward, then you're breaking the link in the chain. If my performance doesn't lead to the outcome that I want, which is the half day off, then I will have no interest in doing the task. And then let's say that I am a very unhappy person who does not want to have time off. Then the reward isn't desirable for me. So do I find the outcome desirable? And the point with Victor Vroom's expectancy theory is that the effort that I put in has to lead to a performance, an outcome that I wish, which has to lead to a reward that I wish. And if any of those kind of links in the chain are broken, I won't want to do the work. Simple one, but I like it. So moving on from Victor Vroom then, let me start to talk about, let me see here, what will I do? I'll do John Stacy Adams. I've got a couple of them that I quite like, but so I just want to make sure that I get the right ones there. Bear with me a second now. Let me just find John Stacy Adams. Okay. So we're now in the 1960s. People are starting to work on more complex work as well. So it's worth noting this is the first time that people have started saying that complicated ways of working are not really working in complex environments. So for the first time, people are working. A lot of people begin to work in complex work, but people are using complicated methods of work, and it's not working. And also the things that motivate people are not working either. And there's lots of new recognition on the models of motivation. So again, this is a process model. So it really looks at it from the effort to the outcome. So I will be motivated if the outcome that I get from my effort is fair. And I will be unmotivated if it's unfair. So if others get more money than me, this will be unfair. And it's worth noticing that, that it's our perception of work that we're talking about here, not the actuals. I mean, at work, a lot of people don't share their wages, so you wouldn't know whether people are earning more money than you or less money than you. But the basic premise of this is that we look at effort to outcome, and we're motivated if it's fair, unmotivated if it's unfair. So we want a fair reward for the work we put in. We also compare my work with others. And it's worth noting that this could go the other way as well. If I believe that I'm doing too much work, too little work for too much pay, people actually regard that as unfair as well. And they try to redress the balance. So if it's unfair, we try to redress the balance. We can try to fit the amount of work that we do into what we believe is the right level for that reward, or else we do things like we reframe it. If it's unfair to our advantage, we may even try to reframe our work to make it more important, to make ourselves believe that our work is more important. So the inputs are what we mentioned at the very beginning, things like time, effort, loyalty, and the outputs then are the rewards, learning, pension, recognition, etc. So there are a number of different types of comparisons that we make. The first one is that we make a comparison with ourselves in the job that we're doing now. My own reward with my effort. Am I getting the right reward for the effort I'm putting in? And then another question that we ask ourselves is, are we getting the right effort against what I would get somewhere else? So if I did the same work in another business, would I get the better reward for it? And this is quite an interesting one because a lot of people look at that when they're trying to leave a job. So if you see people making comparisons like that, a lot of the time people do that when they're about to leave or thinking about leaving. So then another comparison is between others inside in the business, in the enterprise that I'm working in at the moment. So I compare myself with others in my enterprise. And then the last one is comparing myself with others outside my enterprise. And again, this is another trigger to leave. So, the first one is I compare myself. Is it fair for me now? Would it be better if I move? Are others treated better than me in the business I'm in at the moment? And are others treated better outside the enterprise that I'm in at the moment? So that's John Stacy Adams, and that's a very simple view of his equity theory from the 1960s. So let me move on to Ryan and Decy now. And again, we're now talking about the 1980s, 1990s when we have these theories. And Ryan and Decy's is not a process model, it's a content model. In other words, as you can read here, Ryan and Decy say that the important things are that we're given autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And the first thing that I say is that we're now firmly in this area of complex work. And when we're doing complex work, this is what people need. It's a very modern theory on motivation. And one of the main points that they make is about this idea of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And what they say is that, especially with complex work, is that we all want to be fulfilled and we all want to grow. We all want to give our all at the work that we're doing, which is back to McGregor's theory X and theory Y, that we are all theory Y people, and most of us, that we are predominantly theory Y people. And what they say is that if we impose reward or motivation from the outside, extrinsic motivation, this does not work. We have an intrinsic desire for action, for growth, but what we do need from the external environment is to be nurtured by it. So the conditions, there are a number of conditions on which extrinsic motivation will help to motivate us. So what we basically want is autonomy, the ability to make our own choices. Now, this is different. This is not about being independent. We do not want to be totally independent and do our work without anybody else and being in charge of everything. We want to make our own choices about the work that we're doing. The second is that we want competence. We want to be able to grow our skill, our knowledge, our expertise, the ability to become competent. We want to be able to do a good job using our skills, our knowledge, our expertise. And we want to have the confidence that we can do this good job. And we also want relatedness, it came up in ERG a couple of minutes ago, this connection to others. We want to be secure in the environments that we're in. And that, again, like ERG, we need all of these three, what we might call psychological nutrients, in order to feel that to grow, in order to be motivated. And if we don't have all three, just like ERG, we will become demotivated. So the only thing that I will say about external, so this has to come from within. So the only thing I say about external motivation or extrinsic motivation is that it actually helps us if it's unsolicited. So if you say at the end of the 3 months, I'm going to give you a review, this kind of motivation, or at the end of the year, I'm going to give you a bonus, this type of motivation doesn't work. But unsolicited, extrinsic motivation has a huge effect on people. So positive motivation, even something simple like saying you did a really good job last week, has a huge boost for people in terms of motivation. Whereas a negative, unsolicited, extrinsic motivation gives us a huge dip in our confidence. It absolutely leads to a decline in motivation. So if you said to someone, wow, that was a terrible piece of work that you put in, then people will become absolutely demotivated. So 2 points on this one. The first thing is that we all need to have intrinsic motivation, autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And external motivation is not what we need, not reward. And in fact, there are some points about, there are some very good studies in terms of how extrinsic motivation has been very negative for people. But The good news about extrinsic motivation is that if it's unsolicited and positive, it has a very dramatic uplift in terms of our motivation. And the last point I'll make about this is that the social context, our relationship within the enterprise, within the environment, is hugely important. If we believe we are secure and feel secure in that environment, if it's a nurturing social environment, we will absolutely be willing to submit to more imposed rules on us. But if we don't have that security, if we don't feel safe, we will fight back. We will act in a certain manner, a controlling manner, to assert a higher level of autonomy. We will work on our autonomy to get our power, to gain more power, if we don't trust the environment in which we're in. So if we're in a nurturing social environment, we will submit to more rules. We will not, we know that we have the choice in terms of autonomy, but we are happy to sit by more rules. If we don't have faith in the enterprise, in the our sense of security in the place that we're at, we will act in a controlling manner to insert a higher level of autonomy. And this is Ryan, and these are kind of some of the basics of Ryan and Decy's self-determination theory. So continuing on from that one, probably my final one that I'm going to do today. Yeah, I'm going to end with Daniel Pink. Yeah, I'll end with Daniel Pink. It's a good place to stop. So Daniel Pink was not a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a scientist in this area. Daniel Pink was an author. And in 2009, he came up with a book called Drive. And it was one of these New York bestsellers. And he took a lot of the models that we've seen, everything from Maslow down the line to Maslow to McGregor's hierarchy to Ryan and Decy. And he put it all in this quite a famous book called Drive. And the first thing is that he talked about Motivation 1.0, which is basically saying that if we were to talk about the very beginnings of motivation, then it's all down to Maslow's physiological and safety needs. This is what we wanted firstly. We wanted safety, security, economic well-being, etc., etc. He then moves on to talk about Motivation 2.0. And just like McGregor, he talks about this idea of a focus on extrinsic motivation, the carrot and the stick, the promises and the threats. And then he talks about the next level of motivation, which is basically about intrinsic motivation, about internal fulfillment, about growth, meaning making my own choices. This is basically autonomy. He also talked about what he called algorithmic and heuristic work. And algorithmic means that there's rule-based step-by-step, which is very much in line with our view from the Cynefin framework of complicated and obvious work. And he's saying that with Motivation 2.0, which is carrot and stick, this is very much could work when people are doing simple work, obvious work, and into the complicated area of work, of problem solving. Now, heuristic work, which is about enabling someone to discover or learn something for themselves, no rules, constant understanding, having to make interpretations and decisions, and a cyclical approach to work, which is what we call complex work. This is where Motivation 3.0 lives. And this is becoming more prevalent around the world. And he talked about 3 different pillars for intrinsic motivation for Motivation 3.0. He talked about autonomy, which I talked about Ryan and Decy's self-determination theory, mastery, increasing our ability all the time, the ability to become a master of something, and purpose. And purpose basically is talking about meaning, something greater than ourselves. And again, Pink did suggest as well, so not only was he talking about the Cynefin framework, not only was he talking about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, he also talked about having theory X people and what he called theory I people, but McGregor's theory Y people. Is that You need to understand the different types of people that there are. In fact, if I go back a step, he talks about how people who are in Motivation 3.0, how trying to motivate people who are complex workers, intrinsically motivated, how trying to do it with carrot and stick with Motivation 2.0 will fail miserably. He said many different reasons. One is that if we try to motivate them with extrinsic motivators, it robs them of their feeling of control, of autonomy. And this is back to self-determination theory. He said that a number of other points. Extrinsic motivators can diminish performance. They can stifle creativity. I mean, if you're got carrot and stick and you're trying to get people, pressurizing people to get something done quickly, then creativity goes out the window. It also can crowd out good behavior with people as they try to, as they struggle to try to achieve what they need to do faster. Things like good behavior go out the window, and it even leads to things like unethical behavior. And then, and I've seen this myself, extrinsic motivators can become addictive as well. It's this all the time, long-term getting the prize, short-term getting the prize. And they encourage this idea of short-term thinking as well. So what Daniel Pink did in 2009 with his book Drive was to take many of the different points that were made by some of these people in the last 100 years and try to tie them down into one overarching theory that encompasses all three. This idea of Motivation 1.0, Motivation 2.0, and Motivation 3.0. So finishing up on, I'm not going to go into Martin Seligman. I'm just going to give a very quick summary and then just finish up for Q&A at the moment. So the first thing is this. These are 9 or 10 points that I've taken from the overall webinar. The first thing is that in the UK, where I live, 1 in 10 people are engaged at work. And globally, only 20%. So only 2 in 10 people. 8 out of 10 people are disengaged globally. And in the USA, 7 out of 10, 6.5 out of 10 are disengaged. So there's a high level of disengagement in the work in the world that we live in at the moment, in the type of work that people are doing at the moment. While I'm doing that, let me just come back to, let me just bear with me a second. Let me just come back and talk for the last couple of seconds. Let me just stop presenting and I'll come back online again, just to kind of be able to do this. So that's the first point, is that just as a summary, that 1 in 10 people in the UK, 2 in 10 people globally are engaged, and most people are disengaged. The second point is that we need to understand the type of work that people do. So are we doing simple work or obvious work? Are we doing complicated work? Do we do complex work? Or I didn't go into it in Kinevin. I do have a webinar in Kinevin. So what type of work? And we didn't talk about chaotic work, but we need to understand the type of work that people do. The next one, Hertzberg, we need to understand that there's a difference between job dissatisfaction and job satisfaction. And we need to solve those two or motivate both areas separately. The next thing is that, do we believe that people want to work, or people, and that they enjoy it and they get purpose from it, that they're enthusiastic about work? Or do we believe and do we work in an environment where people are only there because they have to? And if we believe that, then our approach will be that we offer them money to be there on their desk. Carrot and stick. So do we believe in theory X? Do we believe in theory Y? Are we working in an environment that gives us one or the other? The next thing is that we need to understand that people compare themselves to other people, both within the organization that we're in and external to the organization. So the question is, do we understand, can we use this more than anything to better understand how to motivate individuals? Then we talk about all the first growth, relatedness, and existence. That there are the 3 areas, which is from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that we need to satisfy all of those. If we're not growing at work, we will start to look at the lower level of relatedness, and we will start to focus our energy on that. And if we don't get any relatedness, if we're not having an environment where we feel comfortable and happy with the people that we work with, let's say, then we will start to focus on the money. So all the first growth, relatedness, and existence. And the next one was when I started talking about, is the reward valuable? The effort, the performance, the reward. All those three things have to be valuable. We have to believe in all those. And if not, then each of those in the chain, if all those three links in the chain are not connected, then we will not find motivated people. And the next one is that we start to talk about Ryan and Decy and about this idea of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And we said that, especially in the world that we work in now with the Cynefin framework, with complex work, that people are only motivated by intrinsic motivation, or that people want to be motivated intrinsically. They do not want carrot and stick. They want to be motivated because they want to grow, they want to be enthusiastic, they want achievement, they want purpose. This is what people want and what we should give them to have long-term employees. So it's all about intrinsic motivation. And the only caveat is that if you give unsolicited extrinsic motivation, this is very, very positive to people. If it's good motivation, if we tell them they did a crappy job, then it absolutely demotivates people. And that moved us on to Daniel Pink, who talked about Motivation 1.0, Motivation 2.0, and Motivation 3.0. And he talked about Motivation 3.0 being about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And these three are the elements that people want in order to be motivated and to be good workers. So I've broken it down. I've given you, so how do we go today? We went firstly with tying up a couple of loose ends. I talked about intrinsic versus extrinsic. I talked about the Cynefin framework. I defined some definitions of motivation. And I also gave you some statistics that say that an awful lot of people globally are not enthusiastic or engaged in the work that they're doing. From there, with these kind of foundational blocks in place, or these pillars, I then started saying there's two types of models. There's a process model and a content model. And I started talking about the content models and the process models. Everything from Maslow, starting there, which is very foundational for the others, to McGregor, to Alderfer, Victor Vroom, and then I ended up from there, Ryan Decy, and I ended up with Drive from 2009. And along the way then, I gave you 9 or 10 different considerations when you're trying to motivate others. So I'm going to stop there. There are many other theories, but those are my favorite 9 or 10 theories that I've given you in terms of motivating other people. And it's not about using one or the other. It's about how do you look at all of those and incorporate all of those in the work that you're doing in the way that you're trying to motivate others. So those were 2 sessions. Last week, I explained how the mind works and how we motivate ourselves. And today is about how do we motivate others. Hope it was interesting to you. I'm going to go to Q&A now. And yeah, I'll open up the floor. So any questions?